Hello, my name is Carlos Pereira Cruz, and this is the podcast 15 Minutes of Pharma. Our guest is Manuel Fernandes, an API specialist, former industrial director, and consultant with decades of hands on experience. Manuel, we've talked about penicillin as the founding moment of the modern pharmaceutical industry in the first episode. And in the next episode, we'll talk about CDMOs and private equity. But there seems to be a big part of the story in between. So, what actually happened to the industry in the decades between penicillin and the CDMO model we see today?
Well, Carlos, it's great to be here with you for episode number 2. And well, that's a great question because, between penicillin and the CDMO model, there's a whole chapter of the industry's history that often gets overlooked. And it's exactly in that period that the foundations of today's pharmaceutical industry were laid. Carlos, for decades after penicillin, pharma was dominated by branded copies, weak patent enforcement, and national regulatory systems. And everything changed when generics, cost pressure, and globalization entered the picture.
So what you're saying is this wasn't a chaotic or illegal phase, right? It was simply a different set of rules.
Right, right, Carlos. Before the rise of modern generics, many pharmaceutical companies, large and small, were already selling medicines that were, in practice, copies of originator products. And antibiotics are a very good example. In Europe and elsewhere, local companies sold antibiotics under their own brand names, even while the original product was well known. And well, these products were legal, common, and they were widely prescribed. But they were not generics in the modern regulatory sense.
So, what was missing technically compared to what we call now a generic?
Yeah, Carlos, at that time, regulatory expectations were very different. Authorities focused mainly on basic safety. They required some evidence of efficacy and acceptable manufacturing practices for the era. So, and this is a key point, there was no formal requirement to demonstrate bioequivalence. So, two products with the same active ingredient could behave differently, different dissolution, different impurities, even different clinical performance, and still be approved. Carlos, at that time, approvals were national. They were not harmonized. This means that each country had its own rules, its own regulators, and followed its own standards. So there was no EMA, no ICH, and no global regulatory alignment whatsoever. Patents were also very different.
Oh, very different. So competition existed, but without today's patent regulatory coupling?
Yes, Carlos, that's exactly the situation. In many countries, pharmaceutical patents were weak, were incomplete, or even poorly enforced. Often patents covered the process, not the product. And well, this allowed companies to develop alternative routes and sell the same molecule under their own brand. And well, this was particularly common for antibiotics, where fermentation know-how spread relatively quickly. Carlos, at this point, I think it's important to understand what did not exist at the time. So there was no ANDA, the abbreviated new drug application, as per the United States FDA parlance. There was no mandatory bioequivalence studies, no patent leakage with regulatory approval, and there was no clear distinction between originators and generics. So there were originator drugs and there were branded copies, and that was the accepted reality.
Then something changed fundamentally in the 1980s, right, Manuel?
Right, precisely. There was, I would say, a seismic change in the industry with the approval of the Waxman Act, which was the real turning point for the pharmaceutical industry. Carlos, the Waxman Act did not create copies, but it created clear science-based and global rules for them. The key goals of the Waxman Act were to encourage the development of generic medicines, to reduce healthcare costs by increasing price competition, while preserving the incentives for pharmaceutical innovation. So, Carlos, from 1984 onward, there was a huge impact on the pharmaceutical industry. So, only products that proved bioequivalence could enter the market.
Come on, Manuel. What you're saying is that single requirement reshaped the entire industry?
Absolutely,
so?
Carlos. Absolutely. Competition became radically more intense and, price became the dominant factor.
Dominant, not just in sales, I believe, but also in strategic decisions, right, Manuel?
Right,
Yeah.
sure. Carlos, a whole new roadmap had to be written. The industry was forced to industrialize costs, to scale its operations, and to run its whole operations looking with the eye on efficiency. And all this while there was an explosion of the generics market with rapid growth of generic manufacturers, particularly in small molecules. Generics became the dominant volume segment of prescription medicines. So we can say, Carlos, that generics introduced a structural price pressure in the pharmaceutical industry. And in fact, there was a sharp price erosion of medicines as soon as generic manufacturers launched their products on the market after patent expiry. Under this new industry setup, APIs and finished dosage products were increasingly treated as commodities once they were genericized.
So genericized. So is this where China and India entered the story, Manuel?
Yes, Carlos. We can say that the Waxman Act was a catalyst for the globalization of API manufacturing. Cost pressure accelerated the relocation of API production from Europe and the US to India and to China. These regions offered lower costs, they offered scale, and at least initially, looser environmental constraints. All these implied as well a shift in the originator strategy. So big pharma increasingly had to focus on faster innovation cycles and even partial externalization of its R&D operations. It somehow had to fine-tune the life cycle management of their products and their portfolios, and they have to double down on the discovery and development of new chemical entities. All these while they have to look and to focus on biologics and complex products, which were products and areas not subjected to generic competition. So, as a consequence of all these, Big Pharma reduced its internal API manufacturing capability, at least for mature products, and many Western API plants become uncompetitive and closed.
Closed. So, but Manuel, we cannot say that this wasn't decline. It's more like a forced choice by them, right?
It was indeed, Carlos. Survivors, they moved towards, higher complexity products, difficult to manufacture fermentation-based APIs, difficult to manufacture semi-synthetic products, and they have to look very, very closely to niche or regulated markets. And so we can argue, Carlos, that all these, set the stage for the foundation of the CDMO model.
Okay, so, and this is where outsourcing stops being just tactical and becomes structural, right, Manuel?
Right, Carlos. Outsourcing became economically rational and strategically sound. We can say that the Waxman indirectly enabled the fragmentation of the value chain of the pharma industry, turning specialization the new currency of the industry. And as a consequence, the emergence of CDMOs as strategic partners dedicated to specific stages of the pharma value chain. So, Carlos, the Hatch-Waxman had a long-term systemic effect on the pharmaceutical industry. It transformed pharmaceuticals into speed industry. On one hand, we have innovation-driven, high-margin patented drugs, and on the other, cost-driven, highly competitive generics.
Okay, yeah, great. So great. Can you make this concrete with an example from your own experience, Manuel?
Sure, Carlos, a good example of how this played out in practice is clavulanic acid. This was one of the first major products to face generic competition in the post-Hatch-Waxman world. In the late 1990s, Sipan decided to invest in a dedicated clavulanic acid production facility. And this was a strategic decision around a technically complex fermentation-based product with real barriers to entry, but growing cost pressure. This case, Carlos, illustrates the dilemma of that period very clearly, either to invest in technology, scale, and efficiency, or lose competitiveness to new global producers.
Okay, yeah. So, Manuel, up to now, we've talked about generics, cost pressure, and relocation of API manufacturers to China and India. So, but many people today associate this period with drug shortages, price spikes, and even cartel-like behavior. So, is there a link? What actually went wrong with this?
Carlos, that's exactly the right question, because this is where the story becomes a little bit more uncomfortable. The Hatch-Waxman Act achieved something extraordinary. It made medicines affordable at scale. But, once cost became the dominant selection criterion, the system started optimizing itself on one direction only. And, when you optimize a system for cost alone, you don't just change prices, you change behavior. And by the late 1990s and early 2000s, a large part of API manufacturing had moved to China. Not because the science was better, but because the economics were ruthless. You know that antibiotic manufacturing is dirty, it's complex, and it's environmental intensive industrial work. And Western producers were facing rising environmental standards, high capital costs, and shrinking margins. Chinese producers operated under a very different regulatory and environmental framework. It's funny, when I visited China regularly between 2008 and 2014, colleagues and business associates there explained something very revealing. Capital investment was often not fully accounted for. So depreciation was not treated as a real cost. And labor was effectively subsidized or even deprioritized in cost calculations. So the state absorbed a large part of that burden. And Carlos, this wasn't short-term competition. It happened over years. Even India, which later became a major API producer, ended up dependent on China for key chemical building blocks. And Carlos, what followed was a classic industrial pattern. Chinese manufacturers dumped key antibiotic intermediates, including penicillin building blocks, onto the global market at prices Western producers simply could not match. And European and US plants shut down one after another. Even trade associations at the time described the situation as a landslide. However, Carlos, once dominance was achieved, prices rebounded sharply.
So what you're saying is that the system didn't just get cheaper, it became fragile.
Right, Carlos. I think that fragile is the right word to describe the situation. And, this wasn't just theory. It had real consequences. In the 2010s, sudden plant shutdowns in China, often driven by environmental enforcement actions, triggered immediate global shortages of antibiotics and sharp price increases. Um, Hospitals and pharmacies, both in the US and in Europe, felt it almost overnight. You know, the system had become incredibly efficient, but also incredibly fragile. And well, Carlos, this dynamic didn't stop with antibiotics. We saw similar patterns in vitamins, where price fixing cartels were prosecuted in the US, and in more sensitive products like heparin, where a single geography came to dominate global supply, raising serious concerns about quality, traceability, and national dependency. And well, at the same time, Carlos, procurement models in the West kept pushing prices down year after year. Manufacturers were being asked to invest more in quality and compliance, while earning less and less per kilo. So, well, at some point, the math simply stopped working. Carlos, when margins disappear, reinvestment stops. When reinvestment stops, quality risks increase, and well, when quality fails, shortages follow. So, Carlos, the irony is this: the same system that made medicines cheap also made supply chains brittle. And well, this was the moment the industry began to realize that cost alone is not a strategy, it's a vulnerability.
Okay, and realizing that, what kind of change in behavior happened in practice?
Yeah, Carlos, it's precisely this realization that well, that sets the stage for what comes next. Consolidation, the rise of CDMOs, and the entry of private equity as a force trying, sometimes imperfectly, to rebuild scale, resilience, and industrial discipline. Well, this is at this point that the industry starts asking not just how cheap can we go, but rather how do we make this sustainable again?
Oh, I think that's where the next chapter begins. Okay, so Manuel, this has been a fascinating journey from penicillin and fermentation tanks to the very foundation of today's APIs industry. So in the next episode, we'll move from origins to transformation. We'll talk about regulation, private equity, CDMOs, and how the value chain has been reshaped over the last decades. So if penicillin created the industry, the next phase reinvented it. Thank you very much, Manuel. Hope to see you in next episode. And all the others, please join us in episode 3.
Thank you, Carlos.